Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Into the Infinite. I'm Charlie and I'm so grateful that you're here. So in this video, I wanted to kind of do a part 2 to that inner critic piece. So I wanted to talk about inner critic and ego anchors. And just that, there's a way that we can kind of go back and forth with an idea. We present it and then we take it back. We put something out there and then we're, oh, but, and we use it qualifiers like, oh, it's just, oh, I don't know. Oh, you know what I mean? And like we do these things that pull away our authority and our power and replace it with this sort of weird nebulous people pleasing. Because what we're actually saying is that we're not really sure and that we don't really know, but we feel like saying something anyway because we do know on some level that we know, but we don't want to stand in that power because of what other people might think of us if we do, or at least this is how I've encountered it, or what we end up doing is negating the truth that we're speaking because we don't feel like we're qualified to say it. So, does that make sense? And like it's like these things where we're fishing. It's like we're, sending out a line into the ethers and we're trying to like fish for this approval and fish for this stuff. And it just is such a waste of time. So, because what we're doing when that happens, now, this is kind of the inner critic's job, right? Is to make you question. And the inner critic's job, in my opinion, and this is true for my life at least, is to make you question. And it really kind of brings you down until you get to a point where you're ready to heal the reason why it was implanted in you and the reason why it's so powerful in your life. So it sort of is that. And people might, you don't need an inner critic to do that work and to go on that journey, but it is the gift of it. So looking at the gift of it, right? So it really is a way of saying that you're not enough. And I think that it's also kind of a passive aggressive, maybe more passive than passive aggressive, but it's a passive way of showing up to a fight before it starts, right? Where you say something and then you take it back by sending out the immediate criticism that someone might have of it or deflecting a compliment that someone gives you, right? Like I've done that before. People will be like, oh, I love those shoes. I love those shoes. Like I have a problem. That's my thing, right? Like I love shoes. I don't have like hundreds of pairs. I'm just very discerning, and the ones that I get are ones I really like, right? So, but if someone will say, "Oh, I really like your shoes," I'm like, "Oh, thank you so much. They were $19.99 on sale for $15.99 at Costco," and like it's like you immediately take the charge out of the compliment because you can't accept it. You just can't go, "Oh, thank you so much." Thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you for noticing. You can't just take it in, right? So you've got to just push it away. And that's also the inner critic at work, because if the inner critic was more silent, you would be able to accept that compliment, because the inner critic is going, I don't really know. You don't deserve that compliment. It's not that you have bad shoe choices. It's that you're this, that, or the other thing, and you are living up to what the inner critic tells you about yourself, right? So it's that kind of negative inner talk. And I think too that when we personify it into an inner critic, some people might find that intimidating because it gives it a sort of charge, because really it's just self-talk, right? Which is always in your hands. And this is also an important point to say, that the inner critic is not something outside of you that is made and, you have to just go into battle to take it down. No, it's not like that. It's self-talk, really. But by putting it into a figure, it helps to put a constellation of disparate behaviors and beliefs and things into one spot so that you can then deconstruct it and take it apart and really do the work to look at it and then replace it with something more loving. So that's why I choose to use inner critic as opposed to self-talk as a sort of framework, right? So this also boils down to, now the inner critic, ego anchors. So the inner critic is a definite ego anchor. And what do I mean by ego anchor? Well, I mean, it is a thing about you, a belief that you have, a behavior that makes it so that your ego doesn't really have to come into question or know itself. And it makes it so that that's the thing that's running the show in your life. Now the ego is really just, I'm not talking about like arrogance or anything like that, not that kind of ego. I'm talking about ego as in the thing that pulls you away from the knowing that you're a spiritual being having a human experience, right? And that kind of puts this wall of guilt and judgment and shame and anger and difference and separation between you and the knowing that everyone else is also having that experience with you, right? So it's this belief in separation, ultimately. And what I find the inner critic does with that is that it creates an imagined adversary. Always, there's always an adversary. Now, I have been a student of A Course in Miracles for just over a decade now. And one of the things that I always come back to with it is the idea that defense is a form of attack. Now, I'm doing this too. I'm not talking about this. I mean this, right? So we catch ourselves all the time doing it. But to clarify, what I'm talking about here is that it's not about defense as in, defending against an actual like war, an enemy that is actually invading. I'm talking about more abstract terms here, right? So when we defend against something by believing that we need to be defended and defensive, which is what the inner critic is, right? Like it's a way of protecting you because out there, the critics out there are going to be so much worse than what's in here, right? No, not necessarily. In childhood, maybe that was, a sort of mechanism that developed to protect you, but you don't need it anymore. Maybe, I mean, if you do, then that might be something to look at, is really structuring your life around things that are encouraging, that are uplifting, that do help you shine, that do help you remember your worth, because no one can really give you that sense of worth. That's an inside job. That's a you thing, right? But that imagined adversary, what if they're not actually coming for you, right? Defense is just another form of attack, but we don't see it that way because why? Well, when we're defending, when the inner critic empowers us in ways that make us want to defend our points, ourselves, what we're doing is separating ourselves from the other person first and foremost. So we lose the ability to connect with them because we're no longer interested in connecting. We're interested in being right. And that is a form of attack, right? It's a form of attacking the other person because you're not able to see their humanity first. And I think that an ego anchor is whatever behavior, whatever emotion, whatever thing, especially judgment, guilt, all of that stuff. These are all of the things that prevent us from seeing the humanity in other people. And that, I'm sure that's a whole other video on its own. But what I want to say is, what if the imagined adversary isn't coming for you? How would your energy shift to accommodate and become a container for more good than not, right? Like if your inner critic just had a moment to, if you took your inner critic and just turn the volume down, if getting rid of it altogether feels really intimidating, and I don't think it's necessarily possible, because I think that the inner critic can also be, confused for our sense of humility. It can also be confused for a sense of awareness about ourselves. So we may not be able to get rid of it ever, right? But the way I'm seeing it here is that's a lot of energy that goes into that. So how would your energy shift if you weren't looking out into the world and you weren't hearing and feeling this sense of like, well, I have to defend that thought. Well, am I actually the right person for this? I don't know. I have to defend. I have to defend before you even get out of the gate, before you even open your mouth. Your energy goes into that space of attack. Why? Because you have to defend something. And the inner critic is a good sign that this is at play, number one. Number two, it also tells you exactly how, the thoughts, that self-talk, what's happening mentally, because it is a mental process, right? What's happening in that moment of self-talk, and how are you discounting yourself as either being qualified for something, or, what you're saying being relevant, or, that you can contribute something meaningful, that you are worth it, that you do deserve it, all that stuff, right? So we show up, right out of the gate, defensive and not seeing our own humanity sometimes, because sometimes this is just a process we engage in internally with ourselves. So the ego anchor is really that form of attack, right? Defense is a form of attack according to A Course in Miracles, and I definitely believe it, because then we turn to other behaviors to justify that position. Because if we're talking to a friend and our inner critic says, well, they have X, Y, and Z thing, and it's way better than you, and it's way better than yours. So you, and this competition and competitiveness, jealousy, envy, all of those things, which happen to map, that is mappable onto the map of consciousness by David Hawkins. So I read about it I picked up the book Letting Go years ago, and it was like 2016, I think. And then Clark Kegley on his channel talked about the map of consciousness, and I've been hearing it more and more. I've heard about it more on Soulful Revolution TV, so that's something else. So I recommend it. If you haven't read it, it's a great read. I highly recommend it. For those who are schooled in Abraham Hicks, it looks a whole lot like the emotional guidance system, but there's a ton more science, which for me, I just geek out about. And I also think that it's a great framework to work with in terms of organizations and things like that, because it does have the scientific backing, right? So how would your energy shift to accommodate and become a container for your good, more than needing to empty because you're fearful of attack? Because if you have that good, you don't need to show up with your armor on, right? So because that, and I'm reading from notes here. So, because that attitude is a form of prosperity, that attitude of, allowing the inner critic to loosen its grip on the reins a little bit, so that you're not coming from that attack place. That is a form of prosperity. That is a form of abundance, because you're coming from a sense of expansion when it comes to what's possible for how people can relate to you, and also what's possible for you to give to others. When's the last time that it occurred to you? When did it last occur to you that you are a delight for someone to interact with, that you are the highlight of someone's day, right? Not from a place of selfishness or self-centeredness, but just because that's true, right? Someone, when you have friends that are really encouragers and that are excited to see you and hear from you, who answer the phone singing and they're like, oh, what can I do? And like, they're so excited to hear from you. When's the last time that you considered that in the face of the worst, acid that your inner critic threw at you? Maybe that's worth considering too, right? Because this shift from, seeing the inner critic and ego anchors that it turns to and defense as a form of attack, it really, it shifts things. But that shift, what that really does is it helps you to see more abundantly. It helps you to see from a more prosperous place. And I'm not talking about financially. I'm talking about prosperity of heart, prosperity of spirit, prosperity of perspective, looking at the people around you and in their fullest humanity, with not a single judgment about them. And for all of the things that they bring to the table, for all of the things the ways that their humanity makes them such a treasure, right? When's the last time that you contemplated the way that everyone around you that is really important to you? So let's say your top 5 people, that their imperfections are something that brings you delight, not because you get to compete, not because they're a point where you're like, I'm so much better than that, but because that's their whimsy. That's their whimsy, right? Like, I had a friend once tell me that sometimes my whimsy tested her, but I think that it was, so just for people who are like, that's not nice, it was more of a joke, because there was a huge chunk of ice on the roof of her van. I can't believe I'm telling this story, but just so that people know that person was not mean in that way. It was just funny because there was a huge chunk of ice and I was driving. This was when I was in my mid-20s, and I had learned how to drive in this van that was terrifying, and the brakes were not great. So I accelerated really quickly, and then I put the brakes on really, really fast. And this whole slab of ice that was on the roof slid slowly down the windshield. We were safe. It was just a side street and there was no cars coming. It was fine, but it was just this slow, and it squeaked on the way down. And it was just really funny, but it was a lighthearted moment where she was like, oh, sometimes your whimsy tests me. And I thought about that, and I still carry that with me, not because of the moment or because of me being at the center, but how many times do we say that of people in our lives? Like, oh man, your whimsy is just so good, right? And it's that place that we can get to when we free ourselves from that inner critic, because the inner critic feels so much unnecessary competition, right? There's more than enough good for everybody. Not everyone sees it though. Some people see that they need to, and the chair is moving not because there's some spirit, it's just my cat. What? She's very desperate for my attention and wanted to be part of this video, so there you have it. But anyways, we think we're getting ahead of things by doing this, and it's sort of jumping ahead of the narrative that someone might form that matches your inner critic, that you're blank or this or that or the other thing. So all of these behaviors of the inner critic and of defense and attack really do not serve you at all. That's not their purpose. They're not designed to serve you. They're designed to protect you. And I said this in part 1 of this set of videos, but that the inner critic's job is to protect your inner child, because there was a time in your life where the inner critic prevented you as a child from more harm. And that kind of is where the lineage of that inner critic comes from. So, and it's not a specific point in childhood either. Sometimes it's traceable back to a memory if we're talking about CPTSD, and not CPTSD as in childhood PTSD, but CPTSD as in complex PTSD. So there's a difference, and on the internet that has been blurred somewhat. So I'm just so that you know what I'm talking about specifically. But we think we're getting ahead of the critics, and I mean, maybe we are in a sense, maybe we are, but do you really want to live from a place of, trying to stave off critics and jump ahead of that and get ahead of what other people are going to think of you? And most of the time that adversary just does not exist. It does not exist. And if it does, why are you giving it any energy, right? But again, like, that adversary just isn't there. It isn't there. The only thing that's most obvious in that moment is your fear of succeeding, doing well, having a great life, feeling abundant, and having an open heart that welcomes things in with so much joy. That's what that says more than anything else. So don't live from that place of attack and defense, my friends. Not, and I don't want to say, I'm not trying to pontificate and be important. It just doesn't feel good, right? Like, if you want to live a good life, you can't live from that place, because it will become a vacuum and suck energy from you. Because all of the energy that could be going towards things like your healing, your abundance, your prosperity, and prosperity, again, not just financially, but in every way. The energy that could be going towards those things is instead going towards building up this wall internally and making sure that you're getting ahead of the narrative of other people and the energy that other people might put out there. And, you're living from that inner critic, which is really hateful. It gets to be really hateful. And I know that that's a charged way of looking at it, because hate is a very strong word, but I think that we turn that inward all the time, and we don't even bat an eyelash. It's just a non-thing. We're like, oh, I'm just critical of myself. I'm thorough. I want to make sure I do a good job. I'm attention to detail. Are you? Maybe. But how much of that is your inner critic, and how much of that is you being objective about the work that you're doing, right? So I think about how it just turns into this verbal sparring that we do with others. And then it's this mental sparring that we do with ourselves. And it's very unnecessary. It's very unnecessary because it turns into a way of life. It turns into a way of life, right? And not a way of life that really is befitting you and your light. So I wanted to offer this as a thought, a couple thoughts, as a part 2 to that inner critic video, and just really pulling back and remember what it feels like to be in your whimsy more than your defense and your attack, because there's a big difference. And it's not that one is so much better than the other. We're not talking about hierarchy here. We're talking about how it feels. How does it feel to be so joyous that you're just driving along and there's nothing really to do, and you slam on the brakes and then, this sheet of ice. But think about that whimsy, right? That sense of fun. And there are times where you need to be serious in life. I'm not going to lie. That's a lot of the time. Adulthood is very much like that. But I think that when we befriend our inner critic and find our inner encourager and hold the inner child that we all have in us, and when we hold that and do that shadow work and really hold that child in our hearts, it allows us to create from such a different place. It's a different place, because then when you say affirmations like I am safe, they mean something. They mean something important. So on that note, this is almost 20 minutes long, and I was like, I'm going to do a 10-minute video to add on to the last one. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me again, and I hope to see you on the next video. If you liked this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye.